racial and cultural connections are consciously uplifted, and a space for art, culture, and politics to intentionally collide. Our busboys and poet servers will be helping us out with putting in orders throughout the program. And I also want to remind you that there will be a Q&A after this discussion and a book signing after the program. And the JINN Daughter is here available for purchase. And for our online folks, the JINN Daughter is also on our Books to Go program, which means you can order the book along with a meal on any delivery app, so you can go ahead and do that tonight as well. And now a little bit about the book we'll be discussing here tonight. Nadine is a jinn tasked with one job, telling the stories of the dead. She rises every morning to gather pomegranate seeds, the souls of the dead, that have fallen during the night. With her daughter Layala at her side, she eats the seeds and tells their stories. Only then can the departed pass through the final gate of death. But when the seeds stop falling, Nadine knows something is terribly wrong. All her worst fears are confirmed when she is visited by Kamuna, Death herself and the ruler of the underworld, who reveals her desire for someone to replace her. It is Layala she wants. Nadine will do whatever it takes to keep her daughter safe, but Kamuna has little patience and a ruthless drive to get what she has come for. Layala's fate, meanwhile, hangs in the balance. Rooted in Middle Eastern mythology, Rania Hanna deftly weaves subtle yet breathtaking magic through this vivid and compelling story that has at its heart the universal human desire to somehow outmaneuver death. Now, about our speakers here with us tonight. Rania Hanna is a Syrian-American writer and researcher with a background in neuroscience. The JINN Daughter is her first novel. Sevde Guzal graduated with a degree in English literature and music and went on to pursue graduate studies in musicology, where she earned a certificate in women and gender studies. In addition to literature and music, her interests span into health and wellness. She enjoys reading stories as much as she does weightlifting, yoga, and learning about nutrition. Her work involves product development in the organic beverage industry. Having grown up as a child of immigrants, she also enjoys discourse on culture and finding our way in the in-between. Now I'll pass it off to our speakers here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, it's on. So thank you for everyone for coming. I'm very excited for Rania and this Q&A, so let's get into it. So with this novel, what was your inspiration for it?
I grew up, I'm the child of immigrants. I think many of us in this room are immigrants or the children of immigrants. I grew up listening to the stories from my dad, who told me, the folklore of Syria, the stories he grew up with, stories that he made up. And so I really wanted to honor some of that folklore, honor some of those tales that he told me. Stories that I think really reflect our culture, reflect our values. And so when I started writing, I really wanted to be able to tell those stories within a larger frame narrative, somewhat like 1001 Nights, which I think is so iconic within our culture. Everyone knows 1001 Nights, and I wanted to replicate that. So a lot of the inspiration really came from my father and all of the stories that he was able to tell me growing up.
And I think, without spoiling too much with the book, did everyone here read it, or who has not read it yet? Okay, then I'm not going to spoil it, but I think that aspect of tradition was successfully carried out in the story with the mother-daughter relationship and different tasks being passed down. So what would you say was the most enjoyable part of writing this novel, and what challenges did you come across?
Definitely, I think the stories, the shorter stories within, mostly again because they're such a reflection of our culture. A major reason I wanted to write this book was to show Syrian culture in a completely different light than we normally see in the media. When you think of Syria, you think of war, you think of refugees, you think of immigration, you think of destruction. We are so much more than that. I think it's not just Syrians. I think people from a lot of different countries feel like they are so much more than what the Western media portrays them as. And so it was really important for me to tell the stories, to show the values that we have as a culture, and to really honor that oral tradition, which is also such an important part of, I think, Syrian and also Middle Eastern culture in general. There's a cafe in Syria in Damascus. It's the oldest coffee house in Damascus. Remember, Damascus is the oldest capital city in the world, still inhabited. So it's the oldest coffee shop in the oldest capital city. They still have oral tradition. So much like we're on the stage here, they bring in these older people, usually these older men, and they'll sit in front of everybody, with the tarbush, the red cap everyone wears. They have the tea, they have the coffee, and they have these books that is just like decades of stories, and it's such a strong oral tradition. And I really wanted to bring that in as well. And so that was very important for me to showcase our culture in a way that's a little different than what you might see. When you think of a lot of books written about the Middle East lately, it's, immigrants and refugees, and it's such a struggle. It's about everyone's struggle, and that's a very important tale to tell. I think it's very important those voices are heard, but I also think other aspects of our culture outside of the war and the destruction and the pain and the suffering need to be told. And so it was such a huge push for me to do that because of those reasons.
And kind of in that sense, so with stories, they often make us think of something in a different way, or they can give us a different perspective on something. With writing these stories and these characters, do you feel that any area of your life, like that your perception or your perspective has changed with anything?
Well, when I wrote the book, I partially wrote it out of a sense of grief. I was grieving a lot of different things. I think a lot of us go through different sorts of grief. It doesn't have to be the death of a loved one. It can certainly be other things. While I was writing, I think I was getting to the acceptance phase of grief, regardless of outside of the book. And I think once I started writing, though, it started reflecting, because in the novel itself, for me at least, it's a story of grief. It's a story of acceptance, right? And accepting some of the losses in life so that you can then appreciate some of the gains. And so I think while writing, I kind of went through those phases of, the beginning of acceptance and then towards the end of acceptance. So I think I learned a bit about myself and what acceptance is and how do you appreciate some of the grief in life, and then, replace that with something a little bit more, a little bit different.
And
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, and I think now that you've said that, I definitely see like those different stages of grief and coming into acceptance in the novel. And I was intrigued with the different styles of prose between the novel's main story and the stories within the stories. Reading the mini-stories made me feel like I was reading a folkloric traditional tale. The style of the main story itself felt like at its core it was that folkloric lyrical style, but it did have a different approach. And with folkloric stories, I feel like the main purpose is the message being conveyed, and each character has a purpose and a role to fulfill. Whereas in some novels, I guess like with more like coming-of-age novel types of things, it seems that the focus is also on like the character development. So when reading, the main story felt that at its core it had that lyrical folkloric style, but it was infused with that character development as the focus. How did you go about writing in these two different ways in the same novel?
I honestly think it came from my dad. A lot of those stories growing up, like the folk tales, it's from our culture. I made up a lot of them, but they were inspired from the stories my dad told me. So that aspect, I think, was very easy and very natural. It just kind of flowed out of me, I think, at a time, especially in life, where, a lot of the folklore, a lot of stories of our culture, and reconnecting with my culture in a different way was becoming increasingly important. With the aspects of character development, I think that is just a natural progression. I think as the characters grow in the novel, they have to develop. Otherwise, you don't really have like a certain end, I think, or a certain flow to the story. And so I think they kind of just came about naturally. I didn't have necessarily a specific strategy or anything like that. It just happened, and I think that's normal and part of as part of the writing process.
Do you feel that because I know you said that you'd gone to Syria twice before, do you feel that your trip there and like seeing the different sites and kind of how each of the places you went, they had like a similarity but also differences. Do you feel that seeing the scenery there kind of influenced your writing as well?
Not so much in Jinn Daughter. I think in other books, yes. I will say it gave me an appreciation for what Syria is, especially I saw it before war. So for me, my memories of Syria are powerful and pleasant, and they're all about family, you know? We went around, we saw so much of Syria. We saw, you know, the mountains, we saw the valleys, we saw the sea, we saw a hardtop desert, we saw a sand desert. I mean, I saw every environment, you know? And so for me, it was such a fun time, and it allowed me to see the Middle East in a completely different light, because I grew up in the US, so my perceptions of the Middle East are based on Western media, apart from what I hear from my family. And so when I went there, I saw people, you know, I just saw people living their lives. I saw people spending time with family. I saw people walking the street, Muslims, Christians, Jews, didn't matter. You know, you're sitting outside as a Christian family, my family's Christian. You're sitting outside, you have a Muslim walking by, and you say, please come in, welcome to my house, come in for tea, come in for coffee, come in for pastries, you know, whatever it is that you're eating. And people just natural. You don't even know them, you don't have to know their names. So when I went there, I saw people living their lives. So I think that helped inform some of the decisions that I made when writing this book, where it was more about the culture, more about the people, and less about any other, you know, media and warfare and so forth that we always see about the Middle East. And so I think that really was what I learned the most from those trips.
And with this next question, I'm going to try to not do any spoilers again. So I appreciate how everyone had a morally gray aspect to them, because most people already have a morally gray aspect. No one is 100% good, no one's 100% bad. So I really appreciated that aspect of the characters, whether it was Nadine lying to her daughter to protect her, or Rami also lying, without spoiling, to help his family in some way. Or it was Abu Ilyas, Layala's grandfather, with his love for his granddaughter, but him also not liking Nadine. So for me, it's important to read books that do make you question the duality of good versus bad, and that very sometimes subtle gray aspect. So how did you reconcile these dichotomies in yourself during the writing process?
I think it was also kind of natural when I was writing the characters, because a lot of them they're just people. As you say, we all have a duality, no one's good, no one's bad, fully. And so I think the characters just developed naturally that way. I will say with Sheikh Hamadi or Abu Ilyas, I had to struggle a little bit with him, because when I wrote him initially, he was the villain. There was nothing good about him. He was just an evil, horrible man who committed genocide against the jinns, and I really didn't like him as a person. I don't think anyone could possibly like him as a person. And so I really needed a redeeming factor for him, and it ended up being his love for his granddaughter, which I feel like a lot of times, you know, how we treat people, how we care about our family really redeems us in a lot of ways. With Kamuna, same thing. You know, I didn't want her to just be a villain. I didn't want her to just be the goddess of death, doing as she will. I needed her to have a redeeming quality, and that is her love for her daughter. And so those dualities I did struggle a little bit with. The other ones, not so much. They kind of just came about because I think that's just who the characters are. That's who they are as people. And that's just how they develop themselves on the page, really. And I just kind of went along with that.
So the ending was pretty bittersweet for me, because despite all of Nadine's efforts, despite all the people who were killed, things ended up the same. So what was interesting was, I'm trying really hard to not do the spoilers again, sorry. Okay, then I'll word it this way. So everything seemed to kind of end up the way it was going to originally end up at the end, but the difference being that in the end, Nadine's daughter and Kamuna's daughter, like that they weren't alone, that they had someone to be with and like develop this partnership and grow with. So the question with this is, I feel like it really brought up the distinction, kind of like good versus evil, but in this way, free will versus fate. I feel like there was like a lot of that in the storyline, even like within the small stories of the main story. With the ambiguity of the concept of fate for Layla, what are your thoughts on the concept of free will and fate?
It wasn't an explicit decision I made to really explore fate versus free will. I think it kind of, again, flowed out because of all the stories my dad told me. A lot of folk tales, at least the ones I was told growing up, they focus on making the right decision given the circumstances you're in and being smart about your decisions. And so for me, I think the way the characters grew, the things that happened to them, the way they decided to make changes, really was just due to their environment. They had to do the best they could with what they had. And so for me, it wasn't so much a story about like fate versus free will. It was more about doing the right thing, given what you know, given what you think you should do, given what's best for you and your family. Ultimately, I think everybody in the book, as you say, they're morally gray. They do what they do for themselves and for the people they care about. And I think that's human. I think that's just humanity. We tend to focus on our blood. I think I swear that's part of like why we're always at war with each other is we see other people as not our blood. And then we see this group of people as our blood, but then this other people not so much and so forth. And I feel like that just leads to so much conflict, which is what it does in the book. There's, Sheikh Hamadi sees the jinns as different than him, and so he's willing to eradicate them. Rami is willing to do whatever he needs to save his family. Nadine will kill left and right to save her daughter. She does not care, and I think that is such a human element to care about our own. And I think that leads us to trouble sometimes, which is what I was trying to explore a little bit in the novel. I kind of touched upon it. Maybe a future novel will explore more, I don't know, but that's kind of where I was going with it. So it wasn't so much free will versus fate. I think it was just the decisions we make, what drives us, and what are the outcomes of those decisions.
It also, wait, did you say something?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So it struck me how young Layla is, just 14 years old, but is so sure about the direction that she wants to take with her life. How do you feel the relationship with her mother might have affected this, and do you think it might have actually made her even more confident?
Definitely. I think Layla is, she sees what her mother goes through as being jinn, being ostracized by society, and she wants something different for herself. She really feels tied to where she is and the life that she has because of how society treats her mother, and she wants so much more for herself. And I think also for her mother. I think she wants to encourage, in some subtle way, she tries to encourage her mother to escape. But she recognizes her mother has a duty. I think Layla is trying to figure out what her duty is, and she doesn't know because she's 14. She is so young. But I think she knows what she has now, what her mother has, is not what she wants. And so she's willing to do whatever she needs to make sure that's not how she ends up. And so I think a lot of the struggle with her, she's confident because she doesn't know. I think she's, she's operating on this fear of being stuck, fear of living the life that society bounds her to. And for Nadine, quite literally bound to the cottage and the woods around the cottage because of the magic. With Layla, I think she realizes that she needs something different, she needs something more, and she doesn't want society to bind her. And so she's willing to do whatever it takes, including dying, to escape the life that she thinks society is trying to force upon her. So, yeah, that's mostly what I want to say.
And I know before you'd said that originally the story started off being focused on Layla, and then later on it shifted more onto Nadine, and then that mother-daughter relationship. When did you notice that shift in focus starting to happen?
Pretty early. Initially when I wrote, I expected the story to be about Layla. I thought it was going to be about this coming-of-age story of a 14-year-old girl who finds her place in life and death. Once I started writing, Nadine just kind of became the character, the driving character. It wasn't something I planned. And I just kind of went with it. I wasn't sure. At one point, I thought it was going to be, changing perspectives, like we're going to switch from Nadine and Layala and back and forth. And it just didn't happen like that. So I kind of just went with the flow. I explored a little bit, and it became Nadine's story. This is her story to tell. I think she really just wanted to be heard, which is a little silly. She's a fictional character, but as a person, we all want to be heard. We all want to be seen, and I think Nadine wanted that. So I think maybe in a future novel, it's definitely Layala's story. I think it's time for her story to be heard and get into her mind a little bit. But for this one, pretty early on, Nadine kind of stole the show.
Does this mean there's going to be another book coming out?
Oh, I don't know. I can't say.
Because that's what I was wondering after I read it.
We'll see. Nothing set in stone yet.
Maybe. So, okay. Okay, then I'll switch questions. Do you have any upcoming projects?
A couple. So one is outside of JINN daughter world universe. There's one I'm working on. It is about star folklore of Arabian star folklore. So when you think of constellations, you think Greek Roman. I think that's kind of what we see in the West a lot. I actually didn't know that like Bedouin in the desert, in the Arabian desert, have their own star folklore. I didn't know this until recently. Mind you, I'm Middle Eastern. I did not know this. So I can imagine everybody else is not really, you don't really think about it because you're so caught up in like the Greek Roman stories. And they're beautiful. But I really want to start exploring some of those other cultures that also have, star folklore. And so I have a manuscript I'm working on. It's similar in style to the JINN daughter, like kind of, stories within stories. It's a relationship between a daughter and a father this time. The daughter saving the father from death. So very similar, but it's more focused on some of the, the constellation stories in Middle Eastern culture.
And for the final question, when I was reading, I felt like there were all these twists and turns, and the plot kind of ended up going in different directions than I was expecting quite a few times. So when you were writing, did you always feel that the novel was going to end the way that it did, or did things just kind of unfold very unplanned?
I always knew, I can't give a spoiler. I always knew something was going to happen to somebody and somebody was going to die. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I knew what was going to happen. And so I kind of I'm a discovery writer, so when I write, I don't plan ahead. I just write as it comes out. And so I knew how I wanted things to end, and I just let the story unfold as it needed to as I was writing. So yes, I knew how it would end. I didn't know how I would get to that point.
And I think that kind of goes with what you were saying about how everyone was just trying to do the best with what they have and with their circumstances as well.
Yeah, I think so.
So those are all of my questions. Thank you so much for writing this book and sharing it with all of us.
Thank you.
So do I give the mic to someone else, or?
I can just pass the mic around to anyone who has questions. You can raise your hand.
I'm interested in what your father's reaction was to the book, and your parents both, and also just if you could describe a little bit about your writing process, because it sounds like as you said, you're a discovery writer, but I want to know what that means a bit more.
Yeah. My parents have not yet read the book. My grandmother did, bless her. She has certainly read it, and my aunt. My parents have yet to do so. I think they will at some point. I don't think they're readers. I was the reader in the house. They fed my addiction to books, and they did not read themselves, but I'm sure they'll get there. I might need to do some oral. Yeah, I really do. That's a good idea. And you have a good voice. Thank you. I'm coming off a cold, so I am scratchy today. But part of this discovery writing, it's hard to describe because it really is discovery. I sit down, like when I started the JINN daughter, I had just finished reading, if anyone's read her, Tahara Mafi. She's a Persian American writer. she wrote the book Witchwood. She's a Muslim Persian American writer. And so she took the idea of corpse washing, and I don't know much about this in Muslim culture. You would know more, I think. So you can speak to it if you do. But there's this idea of corpse washing or washing the dead. And so she took this idea of essentially taking care of the dead. And I loved this idea. I love this aspect of the living honoring the dead. I think it's important that we do so. I think it's very important in a lot of cultures. And so I wrote the first line, the dead have been dropping all night. It just kind of came to me right as I finished reading her book, like a couple minutes later. A lot of times lines come to me, I write them down, I forget about them, I don't bother. But for some reason, this story just kind of stuck to me. And I started writing and I thought, I don't know where it's gonna go. I don't really know what this is about. I will figure it out as I get there. And I did. And so I just kind of started writing. Every day I wrote a little bit, and the story kind of unfolded. I did know as I was writing that I wanted those smaller stories because, again, I want to honor my father. He's the one who got me into storytelling, And so those I kind of just wove in, but again, those weren't really, the specific stories weren't planned. I just kind of wrote them as I went. So it really, I don't know if there's a process I can really describe. It's just, I sit down, I write, whatever comes out that day, great, comes out. If nothing comes out, so be it. I'll, try again the day after, and that's just how it happens. When I'm done, I edit and clean things up, and hopefully things make more sense. So that's kind of the process. It doesn't sound like one, but it works, I guess.
Yeah, I had a question about your choice for the point of view, because I really liked how it's a very sort of folkloric type of writing, and the lyricism was really beautiful. But it was interesting to me that it was in first person, because usually most fairy tales and whatnot, it would be third person or even omniscient, where it's a bit detached, I suppose, because you can see the minds of everyone. So I was wondering what your process was for sort of deciding the first person perspective.
Very similar to what I was just saying with the process. I wrote the first line, and then I just started writing first person. I immediately got into Nadine's head. And like I said, I really thought it'd be Layala's story, regardless of me starting off with Nadine. And that's why I was thinking it would switch between points of views. I'm not sure why I wrote it that way. I think part of it was honestly what I was reading at the time. I read Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. Beautiful book. It's so beautifully written. I loved it. I was starting to get into reading more of lyrically written novels. And I think that's why. I think that's honestly what influenced me. But I do think a lot of folktales, like you're saying third person, but I think there's also an aspect of you as a person or as a character in those stories, because a lot of those folktales, they're supposed to be lessons, and I think it's important to put yourself in them, and I think some of those folktales do that. So I think that kind of just mixed up and became the story it did. I know it's not the best answer because I don't really know. I just decided as I was writing, that's how I was going to write, and that's just what it became.
I'll come back to you. Thank you. Rania, I'm actually, hey, good to see you.
You too.
I'm curious to know, because you are also a neuroscientist in addition to being a writer, I'm curious to know if the science in any way comes into play into your stories, or if you're thinking in any scientific sort of terms when you're writing. Just curious about that. And
Yeah.
It goes in and out.
I don't know. I wouldn't say scientific terms were in there. I think there was cathartic. Yeah, I think it was totally separate from anything with science. I needed that break, and this was a really great way to get that break. I would say, a lot of times people ask, as a scientist, as a writer, how do the two work together? I think because the way I approach writing, at least, is similar to how I approach science. I'm sure you're also a neuroscientist, so you would understand this process. Science is an act of creation and discovery, right? You ask a question, and you seek out the answer. When I write, I also ask a question and I seek out an answer. That question can be, the dead are dropping, they're in the form of pomegranate seeds. What is that world like? Why would that happen? That's my question, and then I kind of seek it out with the writing. So I think ultimately both science and art, we're just trying to figure out life as individuals, as artists, as creators, as scientists, where we have a question, we want an answer, and that's what we're working towards. And ultimately it's just discovery. We're just figuring things out, and that's kind of how I approach both. And I think that mindset informs both the science and the writing for me.
Hi, thank you. This is great. Given that you're trying to counterbalance the general perception that people have of the Middle East and the refugees, the war, did you have to ask yourself with every word or every sentence, how is this going to reflect on people of that culture, of the heritage? Did that make it all very fraught for you, or were you able to sort of relax and write it?
I wouldn't say writing a book is relaxing. It's a lot of work. It can be relaxing. I don't know if I was necessarily specific with every single word. The Arabic in there, it was a very conscious decision to choose not so much the word, but to have the Arabic in there being used in a loving way. So a lot of the words in there, like amr, my moon, my hayati, my love, my life, those are things my dad told me. So when I was writing, I heard his voice. And so a lot of times when I was writing, I was actually very emotional because it was, bringing in my language and the language of my ancestors, of my family, in a different light. When you think of Arabic in movies in the West, it's like, it's so angry and aggressive for no reason. Does not reflect our language at all. Nobody speaks like this. And it's always like the weirdest translations, like some aggressive, violent thing. And for me, I think that is not my experience at all. We are such a poetic language. Like we're very dramatic. We're so colorful and, like everything's amr, my moon, my love, my heart, my eyes, We're so flowery, that's my experience, and I speak it at home with my family. And so I really wanted to bring that to light. And so I chose words that I could hear my dad saying to me. And so I feel like the emotion is in there. I hope it is. Like kushdani, thimble. The father calls the daughter that's what my dad calls me growing up because I'm so short. He calls me kushdani, So I chose words like that. And I think it's important. For me, it was very important the language is in there in a safe and, I don't know how to describe it, but like not in a violent way, It's just a story. It's just people talking to each other and calling each other my life and my love and my moon, because that is how we talk. Nobody goes around saying aggressive things. Like everyone's just calling each other my flower and my eye, you're the love of my life. Like that's just what that's how we speak, And same with the Star book. I want Arabic in there as well because I do want to show our culture in a way that is artistic and poetic because that's our culture.
Any other questions before we wrap it up? Okay, well, in that case, let's give it up one more time for our guest.
Thank you. Thank you to Sevde she drove all the way from Pennsylvania. It's appreciated.
Anytime.
Yes, and I just want to remind you all one more time that the JINN Daughter is here available for purchase. If you already have the book, you probably know someone who would really benefit from having it, so we encourage you to purchase here today. Also, Rania will be signing copies, so this is a really special opportunity. Also, for folks at home, once again, this book is on our Books to Go program, which means you can order the book along with a meal to go from any delivery app or website. So we encourage you to do that also. And thank you all for joining us here tonight. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.